11 million people woke up this week unable to send money, receive medicine, or pay for food, not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because of 2 pages signed on a Friday afternoon. And the most chilling part? It was perfectly legal. Stay with me, because what just happened to Cuba is not just a Cuba story. It is a story about who actually controls the global economy and what happens when that power is used without a limit. If you follow geopolitics and you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button now, because we update this story daily and the next development may already be hours away. Here is what most coverage is missing. The American embargo against Cuba has existed since 1962, 67 years. And for 67 years, Cuba survived it. Not by defeating it, by routing around it. European banks held Cuban accounts. Asian lenders processed payments. Canadian firms moved money through subsidiaries designed specifically to keep a legal wall between Cuba operations and American jurisdiction. The system was fragile, but it worked. Until May 1st. On that Friday afternoon, Donald Trump signed an executive order using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a tool typically reserved for active national security threats. What the order did was not extend the embargo. It transformed it. Any bank, anywhere on Earth, that processes a transaction involving the Cuban government now risks being cut off from the American financial system entirely. Not fined, not warned, cut off from dollar clearing, from the system that processes every major international trade on the planet. The embargo was a wall around Cuba. This order is a wall around everyone else. And the banks did not wait. Panama's Multibank suspended all Cuban government accounts within 72 hours. Spain's Banco Sabadell followed the next day. HSBC began what sources described to the Miami Herald as a comprehensive review, which is banking language for "we are already leaving." At least 3 major European banks with Cuban exposure began internal compliance reviews within 24 hours of the signing. One unnamed executive told reporters his institution would exit all Cuban operations before the end of the second quarter. They are not running from enforcement. They are running ahead of it, because the math requires no spreadsheet. Cuban accounts represent a few $100 million in deposits. Access to the American dollar clearing system represents trillions in daily transactions. There is no decision. There never was. Now here is where it gets personal. And this is the part I need you to sit with. A grandmother in Havana. She is 74 years old. Her grandson sends her $200 every month from Miami. That money buys her food. It keeps the lights on. It pays for medication her local clinic cannot stock. This week, the transfer service that moved that money shut down its Cuban operations. The grandson did not stop sending. The bank stopped processing. She woke up this week with nothing coming. The regime did not lose that $200. She did. Now take that story and multiply it across every Cuban family with relatives abroad. Multiply it across every hospital trying to import antibiotics. Multiply it across every power plant trying to purchase fuel. Every single international payment Cuba needs to make now runs into the same wall. Not because the goods are banned, because the money cannot move. If you are watching this and realizing you had no idea this was happening, that is exactly why you should like this video right now. One tap tells the algorithm this story matters. One tap gets it in front of the people who need to see it. And here is the part of the story that almost no outlet is telling you. This banking sanction did not arrive alone. It is the second phase of a deliberate sequence. The first phase was fuel. When Venezuelan President Maduro was removed from power in January, Trump ordered that no Venezuelan crude would flow to Cuba. Venezuela had been supplying roughly 80,000 barrels a day. Cuba needs approximately 100,000 barrels daily to keep its power grid alive. The supply vanished overnight. Rolling blackouts of 8 to 18 hours began immediately. Water pumps failed. Hospitals lost power. The Treasury Department offered what sounded like a lifeline. Private companies could sell Venezuelan oil to Cuba for commercial and humanitarian purposes. Here is what they did not say out loud. Commercial sales require payment. Payment requires banking. The banking system just closed. The exception requires the very thing the policy just eliminated. The lifeline was offered in a room with no rope. Oil first, then banks. Each phase designed to seal the exits created by the last one. You cut the fuel, and the country begins to suffocate. Then you cut the money, and the country cannot buy fuel even if someone is willing to sell it. The New York Times called it the first effective blockade of Cuba since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That is not a dramatic comparison. Kennedy's naval blockade stopped Soviet ships. This financial blockade stops everyone's payments from every country using any bank that wants to remain connected to the global economy. The international reaction tells you something important about power. The European Union called the sanctions extraterritorial and inconsistent with international law. Then European banks continued closing Cuban accounts because the EU can issue a statement, but it cannot clear dollars. Canada's Prime Minister said his government would review options to protect Canadian firms in Cuba. That review will reach the conclusion everyone already knows. You cannot protect access to Cuba and access to the United States financial system at the same time. You must choose. And every institution chose New York. China called the order unilateral coercion. Beijing did not announce aid packages, did not offer yuan-denominated clearing for Cuban transactions, did not move money. It moved words. Russia said nothing at all. That silence, from a country that has publicly pledged solidarity with Havana, is the loudest signal in this entire story. Moscow's own banks are under Western sanctions. Russia cannot offer Cuba a functioning wire transfer. The country that promised to stand by Cuba cannot stand up a payment system. Richard Penner, formerly of the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, told The Guardian, "The firewall is gone. Geography does not matter anymore. If you bank Cuba, you lose access to America." The entire architecture that kept Cuba connected to the global economy for 67 years collapsed in less than a week. Now I want to tell you what I am certain of and what I am genuinely still working through, because intellectual honesty matters more than a clean take. What I am certain of, Trump found the one instrument the embargo never used. The embargo said America will not trade with Cuba. This order says no one will trade with Cuba. Those are not the same policy. They are different in kind. The first was survivable because the world is larger than America. The second may not be survivable because the dollar clearing system is not American infrastructure. It is the infrastructure of global commerce. Control it and you control participation in the modern economy. Full stop. What I am certain of, this was sequenced deliberately. Oil, then banking. Each move making the previous one permanent. Each door that closes removes the escape route that made the last sanction endurable. What I am genuinely uncertain about is the end game. The administration says the objective is democratic transition. But the historical record of financial strangulation at this scale does not produce democracy. It produces chaos. North Korea has been outside the global financial system for decades. It became a prison state with nuclear weapons, not a democracy. Iran was severed from dollar clearing in 2018. Its government did not fall. Its people suffered. Venezuela has been under comprehensive financial sanctions for years. The result is a humanitarian catastrophe, not a transition. The pattern is consistent. Governments adapt. Black markets emerge. Cryptocurrency moves some money. Friendly intermediaries take the risk for a premium. The people who control authoritarian states find workarounds. The 11 million people who control nothing find nothing. And here's the comparison that is uncomfortable but necessary. In the 1990s, the United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq with the stated goal of forcing Saddam Hussein to disarm or fall. UNICEF estimated that over a decade, 500,000 children under 5 died from conditions linked to the sanctions' collapse of health and food infrastructure. Saddam Hussein remained in power for another decade. He was not removed by financial pressure. He was removed by a military invasion. The sanctions did not produce the outcome. They produced the suffering. And the international community eventually concluded the cost to the population had exceeded any plausible political benefit. I am not saying Cuba is Iraq. The scale is different. The geography is different. Cuba's proximity to Florida changes the political calculus entirely. But the mechanism, cutting a population off from global finance to produce a political outcome in its government, is identical. And the question that haunted Iraq's sanctions for a decade is the same question no one in Washington is answering today. At what point does the cost to the population exceed any plausible political benefit? Nobody is asking it. Nobody on the floor of Congress. Nobody in the White House briefing room. And the 11 million people who will supply the answer through their survival or their suffering have no microphone and no vote. The decision about their future was made in rooms they will never enter, by people who will never miss a meal because of it. I have been tracking this story daily since the fuel blockade began in January. Every chapter has been worse than the last. The oil cutoff, the prisoner negotiations, the tankers that broke through and did not return, the secret talks in Mexico City, the carrier deployments, the resignation demands, and now this, the final layer, each one sealing off another exit, each one narrowing the corridor that 11 million people have left to live through. There is something different about banking sanctions that I want to name directly. Sanctions on trade are severe. Sanctions on fuel are devastating, but sanctions on banking are something categorically different. Banking is not a product. It is the mechanism through which every product moves. When you cut banking, you do not restrict what a country can buy. You eliminate the capacity to buy anything at all. You do not limit trade. You end participation in the modern economy. Cuba has survived catastrophe before. 67 years of embargo, the Soviet collapse, the special period of the early 1990s when the economy contracted by 35%, the pandemic. In every previous crisis, money moved, slowly, inefficiently, through intermediaries and workarounds and subsidiaries with careful legal architecture, but it moved. That movement was the thread connecting Cuba to the world. That thread was cut this week, and I do not know what comes next. Not in full, not with confidence. I am not sure anyone does, not in Washington, not in Havana, not in the foreign ministries that issued statements of concern and then returned to their desks. What I know is this. 11 million people are now living in a country that cannot process an international payment. That fact, more than any carrier in the Caribbean, more than any diplomatic ultimatum, may be the thing that determines what Cuba becomes. I want to hear from you, not just the analysis, what you feel. Is there a version of this where the pressure works and Cuba becomes something better? Or are we watching the beginning of a humanitarian catastrophe that will define this decade the way Iraq's sanctions defined the 1990s? Tell me in the comments. This community consistently produces analysis that professional outlets never reach, and I need that now. If this moved you, hit the like button. One tap. That is what tells the algorithm this story deserves an audience. If you are not subscribed yet and you want daily updates on how this develops, now is the time. We will be here when the next chapter lands. And it is coming.